hop on a Vespa, explore Emerald Hill's charm, or uncover Geylang's hidden secrets. Singapore's fun tours are full of surprises. Join Renjie and me as we take you on an adventure through the city's most unique experiences. So RJ, let's assume I'm in Singapore. I want to spend a day just doing tours.
Yeah.
Right? Tours, seeing places, doing some fun stuff.
Yeah.
So if you had to go morning to evening or night on this episode, what are some of the tours that you would recommend? And let's start with morning.
Okay, so first of all, sounds like a day where you get a lot of steps in.
Yep.
Doing walking tours, which honestly is a wonderful way to discover any city, I always find. But just so that you don't tire yourself out too early on, I would say in the morning, doing something called the Vespa Sidecar Tour.
Mm-hmm. So what's that tour?
Okay, so you know what a Vespa is,
Yep.
right? It's like the Italian scooter. And a sidecar to the Vespa is this essentially a little mini vehicle that you attach to a Vespa for a passenger to sit in it. And it's really cute. It's like a vintage kind of a vibe to it. And the passenger essentially sits very low to the ground, but you go on the roads, right? And you're essentially cruising along next to and powered by the Vespa. But what's wonderful about this tour experience is that you can choose different precincts to go to. So they do different routes. And depending on which route interests you the most, you can go for that one. But I think the most wonderful Vespa sidecar tour that I had gone on in Singapore was through Katong-Joo Chiat, which we've talked about before. It's kind of like the Peranakan precinct in Singapore. Very cool, very vibey right now. But it's wonderful because you are sitting in the Vespa sidecar as the passenger and you have your guide next to you. And they take you essentially to all these different parts of Katong and Joo Chiat that are super picturesque because of the old shophouse architecture that you get around there and the heritage of the entire precinct you can see visibly. But you're also seeing it from kind of almost like street level. So one level below what you would otherwise see walking around or cruising in a car. And it's just a wonderful, different perspective to see what is otherwise a very beautiful precinct.
And how long are these tours generally for?
You know, it goes generally between, let's say, an hour and a half to 2 hours. And obviously, there are longer ones, there are shorter ones, depending on the precincts that you go to. But again, they're really good because you're sitting in there. You get out every once in a while to take a photo and to like explore a local sort of, part of that precinct, that street or whatever. But generally, you're seated. So it's a good way to start the day, explore without tiring yourselves out too much.
And I guess that's when you really get to know a city, right?
Yes.
All right, so that's the first one on the list.
Yes.
What's another one? After this tour is done, where do I
So
go?
let's say in the afternoon, transitioning into the early evening, a wonderful tour, while we're on the topic of sort of shophouse architecture, is a tour run by a lady named Jane. Right? She's British. She's lived in Singapore for very long, but she runs these wonderful tours that are very much through the lens of architecture and design. And so she runs a tour of Emerald Hill, which we've talked about on a previous episode, right? And I think that was the Orchard Road episode. Emerald Hill is a street off of Orchard Road that has these beautifully conserved Peranakan shophouses. And she essentially takes you on a tour of this part, just off of what is otherwise a very bustling, sort of modern part of town, to what feels like a time warp. And you see these old shophouses, and she's essentially bringing you through the history of the place, but also of the people that used to live in these shophouses, the communities coming together. And in the facade of the shophouse, she shows you essentially the different influences, whether it's in terms of motifs or materials or techniques used to build them, or the ways the spaces would have been utilized by the Malays, by the Europeans, by the Chinese, by the Peranakans. All of them coming together is such a fascinating way to experience Orchard Road beyond kind of the wonderful shopping offerings that you have there.
I think the two that you've mentioned are a great way to spend your day, because you're going back in time. At the same time, you're getting to know different neighborhoods in Singapore on the Vespa tour.
And the best part, sorry, I was just say one more thing about this tour, which is the best part is that it ends on Emerald Hill. And on Emerald Hill, there's a wonderful bar, again, which we've talked about before, called Number 5 on Emerald Hill. It's in one of these shop houses, and you get to essentially see and have a wonderful drink from essentially inside one of these shop houses, which I think is just such a wonderful encapsulation of what a shop house is.
So we'll probably end this tour, have a drink,
Yes.
and then probably prepare for another tour.
Yes.
So I guess we have time for one more suggestion. So what would that be that I should do in the evening?
So it's hot in Singapore. We've talked about this. And actually exploring Singapore by night is a really pleasant way to be out and about in a city. That and the fact that in many other cities, you don't really have any options after dark, right?
Yeah.
But one of the more fascinating tours that I had been on very recently, actually, on this last trip that I had made back to Singapore, was a tour of Singapore's red light district. So it's a tour of a precinct called Geylang, which is kind of on the fringes of the city center. And like many city sort of periphery areas, it's kind of got a bit of a grittier vibe, right? It's very local in that Singaporeans flock to Geylang every day of the week for good food, because it's an area that's known for a very rich food culture, and some of the best food that we have in Singapore. But it is also the red light district. It's also the district where you end up having a lot of different communities of migrants living, together. And so the tour is run by someone named Yin Zhou, and he grew up in Geylang. But then he now runs through his company, Citizen Adventures, a tour of essentially the back streets of Geylang. And he tells you about the different communities that live there, and the different sort of industries that are kind of almost on the very margin of legality. And it's just such a different experience of Singapore, because I think people always think of Singapore as the Orchard Road or as the Gardens by the Bay, but this is a very, very distinctly local part of our city. And the fact that you get to see this feels like such a privilege, and that too from someone who grew up there. I think it's a fascinating way to kind of understand the different facets of Singapore.
And that's pretty cool. You get to see all different sides of Singapore through these three tours. Now, if you want to talk about what to talk about on the next episode,
yes,
what do you suggest? Because we've seen all of these neighborhoods in one day.
Yeah, well, whenever I recommend people walking tours, I actually also always tell them that at the end of the day, Singapore is walkable to begin with.
Yeah.
So even if you are doing the tour on your own and exploring on your own, there are all these little pockets of neighborhoods that are very much worth just walking around and, I wouldn't say wandering aimlessly, but walking around with an openness to what is around you. And a great place to do that is a precinct called Tiong Bahru. Which you may or may not know about, but it, I think, is one of the OG hipster parts of town.
Or would you say the hippiest towns of parts of Singapore?
I would say so. So why don't we talk about that on the next episode, because it's just such a rich precinct to explore.
Well, I'm excited for that. So let's talk about Tiong Bahru on the next episode.
Cool.